Reading in the Reference Guide to Regulatory Compliance within Reg Z, discussing the new closing disclosure and how lenders must make disclosures about payoffs and payments labeled total payoffs and payments, which include the total payoffs and payments disclosed on the loan estimate disclosure labeled loan estimate, the total amount of payoffs and payments, the prominently disclosed statement did this change, and if the amounts are different, a statement of the fact, or if the amounts are equal, a statement of that fact. So basically, this is where you compare the loan estimate to the closing disclosure. Cash to or from the consumer labeled as cash to close is got to be on the closing disclosure, and it includes the estimated cash to close on the loan estimate together with the statement of whether the estimate amount is due from or to the consumer, and the final amount due or from the consumer with the statement of whether it is due to or from the consumer. Another item to disclose is the closing cost financed, labeled closing cost financed, paid from your loan amount, including the final amount due from or to the consumer, calculated as the sum of the loan amount, the closing costs, the final borrower paid costs before closing, and the final amounts of payoffs and payments that were made to third parties. Closing cost finance, labeled closing cost finance, paid from your loan amount, that's the same title, including the sum of the final loan amount and the final amounts of payoffs and payments to third parties, but only to the extent that the sum is greater than zero and less than or equal to the borrower paid closing costs minus the lender credits. And I'm assuming this is the last item that has to be disclosed. It's the closing and loan cost details under the heading Closing Cost Details, with columns designating whether the charge was borrower paid at or before closing, seller paid at or before closing, or paid by others, and all loan costs associated with the transaction that include the following information in the appropriate column. That's origination charges and amounts paid by the creditor to a third party originator, along with the name of the originator and all borrower paid charges paid pre-closing. Also include the itemization of charges the borrower did not shop for, along with the names of the third parties to whom payments were made. If the borrower was provided a list of service providers and chose one of them, the cost should be included in this itemization. And I include also an itemization of charges the borrower could shop for that were provided by persons other than the creditor, the name of the person receiving the payment, and the total of all itemized costs that are borrower paid at or before closing. If the borrower did not choose a service provider from the creditor supplied list, the charge must be itemized in this section. Total loan costs paid by the borrower, the sum of all costs itemized above. No, there are more things that have to be on the closing disclosure, and they include closing cost details, described under the heading Closing Cost Details, and in the appropriate column with the appropriate headings classifying the costs. That's taxes and government fees expected to be paid to state and local governments for recording fees and transfer taxes, prepaids, items by the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment, initial escrow payment at closing, including an itemization for each escrow payment as well as the aggregate adjustment. Other charges labeled as other, an itemization of each amount for charges that are required or obtained in the closing by the consumer, seller, or other party, and including the name of the person ultimately receiving the payment. The word title must appear at the beginning of any title-related charge. Total other costs, borrower paid, to include the sum of all amounts paid by the borrower at or before closing. Closing cost totals should be disclosed as well. These are labeled total closing costs, in parentheses, borrower paid, including the sum of the following, designating which are borrower paid or seller paid. Descriptions must be consistent with how the charges were disclosed on the loan estimate. There's charges the borrower shopped for, charges the borrower did not shop for, origination charges, taxes and government fees, prepaid charges, escrow payments, other closing costs, and lender credits, which is a negative number. Another item being disclosed in the closing disclosure is calculating cash to close, labeled as such with the statement, use this table to see what has changed from your loan estimate, including total closing costs disclosed on the loan estimate. 2, the total amount of closing costs disclosed on the loan disclosure. 3, a prominent statement, did this change? 4, if the amount changed, include a statement of that fact. 5, if the difference is attributable to a difference in changes that are in either or both subtotals on the loan disclosure, a statement that the consumer should see the total loans costs disclosed on the loan disclosure, and if the increase exceeds the limitations on increases in closing costs, a statement that the increase exceeds the legal limits by the dollar amount of the excess, and if a refund is provided, a statement directing the borrower to the required disclosures on refunding excessive closing costs. If the amount disclosed on this disclosure is equal to the estimate, a statement of that fact. Disclose further on the closing disclosure, closing costs paid before closing, which includes under the subheading estimate the label closing costs paid before closing and the dollar amount of $0. Under the label final, the amount of the closing costs disclosed as borrower paid before closing and should be a negative number, and the prominent statement shall be, did this change? And if there is a difference of the fact, or if they are equal, a statement of that fact. Under the subheadings estimate, the amount disclosed on the loan estimate of closing costs financed. Under the subheading final, the actual amount of closing costs that are paid out of loan proceeds, negative number, is what that should be. The prominent statement, did this change? And identifying whether it did or it didn't. Down payment or funds from the borrower. This is exactly the same. It is a comparison of the loan estimate to the closing disclosure. The same has to happen with the deposit, and the same has to occur with funds for the borrower. Funds for the borrower? Does that really say that? Funds for the borrower, which I guess is what's being what the borrower's applying for, a mortgage. Whether changed from the loan estimate. The funds for the borrower will be calculated by subtracting the principal amount of the credit extended, excluding finance closing costs, from the total amount of all existing debt being satisfied. The positive, negative, or $0 amount must be disclosed to the borrower. Seller credits shall be compared to the loan estimate as explained before, same with adjustments and other credits. Cash to close. Disclosed on the loan estimate versus final cash to close, and a summary of the borrower's transaction. Include the statement, use this table to see a summary of your transaction. One table is labeled borrower transaction and should include the total amount due from the consumer at closing, the amount of the contract sales price of the property, the amount of the sales price of any tangible personal property excluded from the sale price, and the total amount of closing costs disclosed that our buyer paid, a description and amount of any additional items that the seller has paid but which will be reimbursed by the consumer at closing, the adjustments for payment taxes, prepaid taxes I should say, assessments and other items paid by the seller and reimbursed by the consumer, labeled specifically at the end the time period corresponding to the amount paid, itemization of amounts already paid by or on behalf of the borrower, including any deposit, amount paid to the seller or held in trust by an attorney or other party for the sale of the property, the loan amount, the amount of any existing loan that the consumer is assuming, or any loan subject to which the consumer is taking title to the property. Furthermore, disclosing or itemizing amounts already paid on behalf of the borrower, a seller credit, the total amount of money that the seller will provide at closing as a lump sum, any other credits with the description of the amount, the description of adjustments for item unpaid by the seller, the amount of any prorated city or county taxes due from the seller to reimburse the consumer and the corresponding time period. The prorated amount of any unpaid assessments due from the seller to the buyer and the corresponding time period. A description and amount of any additional items which have not been paid and which, the consumer is expected to pay at closing but which are not attributable to the time period prior to the closing. A calculation of borrower's transaction, a calculation consisting of the sum of the following along with a statement that the disclosed amount is due from or to the consumer and the amount due from or to the consumer at closing, the total due from the borrower in that section, and the total already paid on behalf of that borrower. Disclose further on the closing disclosure items paid outside of closing funds, which are costs that are not paid from the closing funds but would otherwise be disclosed in the closing statement table and should be marked with the phrase paid outside of closing POC and include the name of the payee. A summary of the seller's transaction versus, the summary of the borrower transaction that we just went over. And that must be on a separate table, including the following 7 items, itemized as paid from funds other than closing funds, including the amount of the contract sales price of the property, excluding the price of any tangible personal property, a description of the amount of other items paid to the seller by the consumer, such as charges that were not disclosed on the loan estimate, the description adjustments for items paid by the seller in advance, the prorated amount of any prepaid taxes due from the consumer to reimburse the seller and the corresponding time period, the total of any prepaid assets due from the consumer to reimburse the seller in the corresponding time period, a description and amount of any additional items paid for by the seller prior to closing and reimbursed by the consumer at closing. Further, under the summary of seller's transactions, the itemized amounts due from the seller calculated as the sum of items required to be disclosed pursuant to this section, excluding items paid from funds other than closing fund, including the amount of any excess deposit dispersed to the seller prior to real estate closing. B, the closing costs paid at closing. C, existing loans assumed or taken subject to. D, the payoff of the first mortgage lien. E, the payoff of any second mortgage lien. F, the total amount of money and of any and all other obligations required to be paid by the seller at closing. H, the adjustments for items unpaid by the seller. I, the prorated amount of any unpaid taxes due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at closing along with the corresponding time periods. J, the prorated amount of any unpaid assessments due from the seller to reimburse the consumer at the closing and the corresponding time periods. And K, a description and amount of any additional items which have not yet been paid and which the consumer is expected to pay after closing but which are attributable in part to a period prior to the closing. Calculation of the seller's transaction, the amount calculated as the sum of the following along with a statement that the amount is due from or to the seller, the total due to the seller at closing, the amount due from the seller at closing, a statement that the amount is the amount due to or from the seller at closing and how it's calculated, and items paid outside of closing funds marked POC, and the party making the payment. Loan disclosures required under the closing disclosure is must be disclosed under a master heading additional information about this loan and under the heading loan disclosures. A statement of whether what to include in that section is a statement of whether the subsequent purchaser can assume the loan on the same terms and conditions, a statement of whether the legal obligation permits the creditor to demand early repayment of the loan, and if so, a reference to the note or the loan contract. 3, late payment information. 4, a statement detailing any late charge stated as a dollar amount or percentage of the late payment amount and the number of days that a payment must be late to trigger the fee. 5, negative amortization information, including a statement of whether the regular payment Principal payments may cause the principal balance to increase, and if a regular periodic payments do not cover all of the interest due, a statement that the principal balance will increase and will likely become larger than the original loan amount, and will lower the consumer's equity in the property. If the consumer may make regular periodic payments that do not cover all of the interest due, the creditor must provide a statement that if the consumer chooses a monthly payment option and does not cover all of the interest due, the principal balance may become larger than the original loan amount, and the consumer's equity in the property may be lower. Further, the lender must disclose the partial payment policy and security interest and make escrow account disclosure. But I'm going to go into that at another time.